You got your offer accepted. Now what? Most buyers think the hard part is over, but this is where the real work starts. Today, we're going to break down the steps between getting your offer accepted and getting the keys. That way, you know exactly what to expect. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Sam Enright, and sitting across from me is my co-host, Zach Dixon. Zach, what's going on today? How are you, man?
Oh, fantastic. Cannot complain at all. Beautiful day, beautiful morning. Excited to be here for sure. How about you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good today. So, not much to complain about. Business is good and life's good. So, I got my health. It's all you can really ask for in life, right?
That's 100% the truth. Every single day you wake up is a blessing. So, got to take it as
Hey,
such. Absolutely.
I remind myself of that every morning. So, um, but yeah, what do we got on tap for the listeners today?
We have on tap what happens after your offer gets accepted. So this is a topic that we've kind of touched on in previous episodes and across the how to buy a home series that we did earlier this year, but going to take it a little bit further, one step further, and kind of go through the details of what exactly happens the moment that offer gets accepted, and then all the way up until you finally get your keys and close on the home, and now the home is yours. So going to take it a little bit further, take it a little bit further of a deep dive here on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, um, kind of as we alluded to in the intro, a lot of people do believe that, getting the offer accepted, right? Going out, finding the house, making the contract offer, and then the seller finally saying, "Hey, we're going to accept this. You're in contract." They think that, that's the major, the major milestone within this, right? And so, a lot of people don't understand that there's a whole different side to it. Once that actually happens, we have clients that are caught off guard, I would say, when a pre-approval letter, just gets them in the door for the offer. And then there's more work to be done on the lending side, on the back end. We have people that are a little surprised by that. So, and then you have other people that obviously, kind of know what to expect. But, this is to kind of help bridge that gap, I would say, between the people that think that that's, the once I have this, we're good to go versus, okay, hey, this is, kind of where, it begins getting real, in order to make that last like 30-day push, to get that property.
For sure. And I think that's a conversation that I've had with buyers, as we write offers and we get to the closing day section in the contract. And I'm like, we're looking about 35 days out, and the conversation, why can't we close sooner? Well, there's a lot going on the back end that, obviously you're going to find out as a buyer as you go through the process, but you probably don't know to begin with as you're writing those offers, especially as a first time home buyers. So definitely a conversation that I've had in the past, and probably will have going forward. But hopefully we can dispel some of the myths here in the episode today.
Well, the good news is if you have them going for you can just say, hey, go check out this episode on YouTube, and you'll get exactly what you're looking for out of that. So, um, well, yeah, I mean, I guess let's jump into, kind of the first thing, that happens. Obviously you are boots on the ground, you're there, you're writing the offer, you're helping them negotiate these things. So, once a seller, I guess once a listing agent comes back and says, hey, seller accepts, give me the kind of in that first 5-day time period, what does that look like as soon as that gets accepted, right?
Well, one of the most exciting parts of it is literally just that initial phone call to the buyer itself. As soon as you get the signed contract back from the seller, that phone call to the buyer is an awesome phone call to make. It's significantly better than the flip side, and letting them know that they did not get the property, that the offer was not accepted. So that is first and foremost exciting in itself. I always enjoy making that phone call because you can just hear the excitement on their side of the phone, through the phone. So always enjoyed that. But getting started on the actual real estate process, contract process, most typically the first thing that's going to happen once we get accepted is we are going to have inspections, and typically that's going to be done rather soon, right after acceptance, whether that's, 3, 5, 7 days, likely at the most. After acceptance, you're going to have inspections done on the property. Obviously, the purpose of these inspections are to identify major issues and ultimately negotiate repairs and credits based on those issues that show up on the inspection report. Um, Obviously, like we've talked about in previous episodes, there's going to be most typically a lot of things that show up on this inspection report. And so our goal, our, what we're looking to get done in this process is to have a win-win for everybody. Obviously, we agreed on terms within the contract to begin with, but depending on what shows up on this inspection report, we are going to be trying to find a path forward for everybody that everybody feels comfortable with. Everybody feels like they got at least a little bit of what they were looking for out of that. So I would say some of the typical, repairs that we see are going to be, just odds and ends things, chipped paint, electrical outlets hanging off of walls or junction box covers not covering the electrical outlets, mostly small things. But again, this does allow for large ticket items to be discovered before the fact and ultimately negotiated, or the contract terminated at that point as well. So we get this done within the first 3 to 7 days of the contract acceptance, as we've talked about previously, to ensure that we have a very small path of resistance going forward. Once we get through this, there's only a couple of other things that we have to really worry about and really be concerned with that may derail the deal as a whole. And so that's exactly why we want to get that done early, get any potential problems out of the way and fixed, and ultimately negotiated or figured out, ultimately, before we get too far in the process and waste a lot of people's time. So um, again, like I mentioned, it's going to probably be a long report when you get it back. So again, we don't need to panic on everything. We want to use or do our due diligence and use our brains, obviously, when we're looking at this report. But we want to, again, make sure everybody is feeling like they're coming out of the process with a win, something that they were looking for to get out of it. Ultimately, your home inspection is not about nitpicking. It's about protecting yourself as the buyer. Small fixes are going to be very, very normal for the inspection report, but what you're really looking for are deal breakers, foundational issues, roof issues, electrical issues, and then plumbing as a whole. Those are the things that may derail the deal, that should be caught ultimately before we start moving forward in the actual contract process as a whole. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then on the flip side, just to kind of give, I guess, both sides of it, right? Because you're basically, as a buyer, you're working two things, I guess, kind of simultaneously, right? I mean, I know that, on the real estate side of things with your real estate agent, and from my understanding, is very front loaded, right? So you're gonna go out, you're gonna look for the properties, you're gonna figure out which one you want to make your offer on. Once your offer is accepted, you're gonna work on home inspections, you're gonna negotiate, repairs, that sort of thing. But at that point, once that's all done, that's where really the lender kind of steps in and becomes kind of the focal point of like, hey, let's get this thing to the closing table. Let's get this done. There may be some odds and ends things that need to be taken care of throughout the process, any addendums or any renegotiations of that sort. But, during this process of the home inspection, right, Zach's going to get an accepted contract. He's going to forward that over to me and say, hey, here we go. This is what we're going to do, or here's the contract accepted. What I'm going to do is I'm going to then, work on the file that we already have started for you. We're going to get everything basically built out for this property specifically. We're going to, put in your purchase price. We're going to get your property taxes in there. We're going to look at where rates are currently at, right? We're going to get the whole file ready to go. And then we're going to send what's called your initial set of disclosures. This is going to be a large packet of documents. There's going to be all sorts of different things in there, just depending on the type of loan that you're going through. Each loan has different disclosures that have to be sent out. Your initial package is going to have what's called an acknowledgement of an intent to proceed. Essentially, we have to have this document signed, which basically is an agreement that you have decided to move forward with us as your lending company. Before we can do anything, order appraisals, move milestones, anything at all, this document, these documents need to be signed and taken care of. And so, while you guys are going through the home inspection period, that's going to be priority number one for us on our end, right? We're going to be working on getting those documents out, getting them in front of you. That way you can review everything, make sure everything looks up to standard the way that it needs to be, get all of those signed. And then at that point, that's when we can kind of start to move forward, on our side of the process with getting the lending and everything taken care of. This is also a time where we may collect documents, right? So if you, let's say you got pre-approved 3 months ago, you submitted pay stubs, bank statements at the time, most of those items are going to expire at that point. We have to have updated pay stubs within 30 days of your initial disclosure date. Banking, same way. So, this will be a time where we'll reach out, say, hey, we need updated docs, we need updated this. That way, once we get everything ready to go, we have everything signed, we're ready to move milestones, get you into the processing queue. That way, we're ready to get you into underwriting, right? So, that's going to be something to look out for on the lending side of things, while you're also kind of simultaneously working on the home inspection part of it and making sure everything's up to standard on that side. That's going to take us directly into, kind of the next step with everything, right? Which is going to be your appraisal. This is something we've talked about a lot. Obviously, home inspection versus appraisal, right? What are the differences? What are these two reports that you're basically being asked to pay for within the first 7 days of your contract? And so a couple of things on the appraisal front, right? So we always communicate with the agent, we'll always communicate with you, the buyer, and say, hey, what is going on with inspections? The reason for that is because, like Zach said, that inspection is ultimately going to decide what you guys are doing from the standpoint of, are you going back to renegotiate repairs? Are you going back to renegotiate a lower purchase price due to some things that came back? Are you renegotiating seller concessions due to these items? There's a lot of things that are potentially up in the air. Even more so, we have had clients who have gotten a home inspection and said, I want nothing to do with this house, I'm going to walk away. And so at that point, we don't want you on the hook for two separate reports, right? Because we do charge our borrowers for an appraisal up front. And so we always wait for that home inspection period to be over, everybody to give us the thumbs up, the green light, say, hey, everything's good to go. Because if there are some repairs that are going to get called out on the appraisal, having those done before the appraiser sets foot in the property is ultimately going to be beneficial for all parties, right? Because if we know the appraiser is going to call it out, we don't want to have to send them back out to the property to already take, to relook at things that we already knew were going to be asked to be fixed, right? So, you know, at that point, once we get that, hey, everything's good, we're going to collect the appraisal payment, we'll get the appraisal ordered. Typically right now we're seeing most appraisals come back within 7 to 10 days, not business days, like actually 7 to 10 days. I mean, we had one with a client that we're working with that came back in actually like 4 business days. So, every appraiser is a little bit different. Some are faster than others, but that's typically a time period that we're looking at, right? Is 7 to 10 days. So the appraisal, this is going to be a big one because it's going to determine the value of the property. And that's ultimately what we're sending the appraiser out there for, is to determine that the property is worth what you are in contract to purchase it for. So, if you offered 200,000 on a house, that's your purchase price, but the house only comes in at 195, that's going to be an issue, right? That's something that we're going to have to look at. So that's part of that appraisal process, is ultimately we're going to determine value, make sure there's nothing major going on. So, we do have clients that still do waive home inspections. So this is going to be a big one for those people as well. If you waived home inspections, the appraisal is going to call out, any major defects that are visible at the property. If we're talking leaks, or if there's, appears to be roof damage or anything like that, like those things are going to get called out. This is much different than a home inspection, though. Zach will tell you, obviously, very different. This is not going to be the nuts and bolts and screws of everything that's going on with the house. But, if there are some major issues, they will likely be called out on the appraisal. And then once the appraisal is back, obviously, that's going to take you back into kind of the negotiation phase, depending on what happens with the appraisal. If it comes in lower, obviously, that's something that we'll have a discussion with all of us, all parties, we'll communicate with the buyer's agent, let them know, hey, this is where the value's at, negotiate with you, the buyer, and then you guys will kind of take that back to the seller. Obviously, in today's day and age, I mean, most of the time we're not seeing appraisals come in under value. I haven't seen an appraisal come in under value in probably 6 months. So it's not common, but it is something to be aware of, especially as we maybe graduate into, maybe the next phase of the market, right? Because we've been in this kind of certain market state for the last 3 years, 4 years, and things may change around here. You just never know. So, um, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the appraisal can make or break your deal. If it comes in under value, you have essentially three options, right? You could pay the difference, you can go back and renegotiate with the seller, or you can ultimately choose to walk away from the property entirely. This is why knowing your budget and knowing your numbers matters.
Absolutely, man. Because I couldn't agree more. Because ultimately, knowing your numbers matters. Because you you as a lender can't lend on this property if it comes in low. You do, like you just mentioned, there are three choices. You have to bring the money out of pocket, you have to have the seller agree to the lower number, or ultimately you have to walk away from the property. There's no Unfortunately, there's no workaround to get financing for a property when the value comes in low. At some point, that money's going to have to come out of your pocket, or you're going to have to be a pretty good negotiator to get it figured out, and move forward. So it's just ultimately just something to keep in mind, in the back of your head, because again, like you mentioned, it's not very common, but it does happen, and just need to be prepared for that situation if it does arise here, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think market dictates that more than anything, right? Because there a few years ago, we were seeing appraisal gaps more commonly. I know not big in certain areas of Ohio, but I know in Franklin County, those sort of areas, when you were wanting to be competitive and that sort of thing, you're willing to do and go above. I mean, we actually have an appraisal gap deal right now, which I haven't seen one of those in probably a year or two either. But covering upwards of 15,000 of a short appraisal, which, again, that's all within your negotiating, rights. You can do whatever it is you want. Zach is obviously, drilled this into you guys time and time again. Everything in real estate is negotiable. So you can put those sort of clauses in there if you would like. Obviously I think it's more market dependent. I think it's more depending on, is it super competitive? Do you need that upper edge to put that in there? Um, it's always something you could have in your back pocket. But yes, I mean, if an appraisal comes in 5 grand short, we've had situations where, I remember one last year, like last November, we had a client came in 5 grand short. The client covered 2,500, the seller covered 2,500. So they bumped the purchase price down 2,500, and the buyer ultimately came out of pocket with an additional $2,500. So that was kind of their resolution. I've also seen it where the seller takes the complete L, or not. I mean, I guess not L, depending on how you look at it, because that's ultimately the value that was determined by the appraiser, but you know what I mean? So, they'll say, okay, it comes in 10 grand lower. Fine. We'll lower the purchase price. And that's what we'll do. We've seen it where, they've renegotiated the purchase price, but also lowered seller concessions at the same time to kind of help make up that gap. Right. So, I mean, if they were getting 5 grand, I've seen them lower it to 3 while lowering the purchase price down to whatever the appraised value came in at. And so there's compromises on both sides, most typically, when it comes to that. Very rarely do we see somebody walk away completely from a property due to, a low appraised value. Ultimately, at that point, you've already invested a home inspection, an appraisal, likely multiple weeks at this point, because you had your home inspection, which was 5 to 7 days, and then you had to wait another 7 days for the appraisal to come in. And so we've invested time, right? And so for the seller to take this back to market, they got to put it back on the market. They got to wait for more offers to come in. They got to then wait another 30-day period. And at that point, it's like, hey guys, we're 14 days out from making this happen. What can we do to compromise on this a little bit to make it work, right? So I would say walking away is probably the least likely of option that we see happen, but it does happen if obviously you're dealing with the seller who's unwilling to budge at all, and you're like, I'm not paying the extra money. So you got to just be prepared for anything and everything out there.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think just like as you mentioned there, you as the buyer, if you're in that situation, you do have probably the upper hand, the leverage in that situation, because again, the seller does not want to take it back to market, put it back on market, sit there for another 30 days. And in some cases, if the original buyer is FHA, they can't. There's not another appraisal they can do to get a second opinion on that value of the property. So going to get a second buyer, doesn't always necessarily work out in the favor of the seller. So I would say, generally speaking, that the buyer is in a position of leverage in this situation if they do come with a short value a little bit. So always something to keep in mind for sure.
Yeah. 100%, man. Well, obviously that's a fluid situation and something that I'm sure we'll talk about in future episodes. And if we do see the market turn and those things start to become more common, such as short appraisals or appraisal gaps, or get back to that sort of time period. Right now, I don't think that it's a huge deal, but just something to put in the back of your brain and be aware of that could potentially happen. Um, so yeah, getting into kind of the next section, right, which is also going on simultaneously while we wait on the appraisal. Typically, what's going to happen is we're going to order your appraisal and then we're going to submit your loan to underwriting for an initial underwrite. This is after we've gathered your updated documentation, such as pay stubs, bank statements. We should already at that point have W-2s. Obviously, those don't expire. You only get them once a year. Driver's license, that's going to stay for most likely. Most people are getting 4 to 8 years out of their license nowadays, so very rarely need those documents updated. But once we have those, our processor is going to go through. She's going to there's a few certain steps that we take in a processing milestone. Obviously, we'll pull like a certification, make sure the property's not in a flood zone. We'll pull a fraud and data verify alert. Make sure that all the information that's on the loan is correct, factual, that sort of thing. And then after that, we're going to submit everything over to the underwriter. Typically, right now, we're on about a 48-hour turn time for our underwriting team. So, once we submit everything, we're typically having that file reviewed within 2 days. So at this point, the timeline is going to be that we're going to have that back before we even have the appraisal back. And so what's going to happen in that gap period is that while waiting for the appraisal, we're going to reach out to you, say, hey guys, here's the list of items needed from the underwriter. So the underwriter is going to go through, they're going to review everything from purchase contract to your documents to property to just everything across the board, right? So they're going to make sure that all the um, information lines up. So some typical conditions that you're going to see on a conditional approval are going to be things such as appraisal. FHA has about like 7 to 8 conditions that all have to do with appraisal when they come back. Things that need to be ran through a certain system. You have to log it with FHA. It's a whole list, right? And so there's those conditions based on each loan type. There's going to be title work conditions. So at this point, we've already placed our title order. Title company is working on getting title work back for the property, making sure that it's free and clear of liens, judgments, those sort of things. That way you guys have a clean title when you go to purchase this property. You're not carrying over any of those things. And so, and then anything that's related to you, if we need to get verifications of employment to kind of, calculate income, if we're looking for any sort of LOXs, like things such as, addresses that don't make sense or have been listed in the last 2 years that you haven't actually lived at, inquiries on credit. Those are just sort of kind of the general conditions that we see come back on most files. Obviously, the more you have going on, the more that there is to kind of break down there. But yeah, that's going to be what's going on underwriting. We do our best to try to collect everything that we can before the appraisal comes back in, because as soon as our appraisal comes in, it's going to go directly back to the underwriter so that they can review it, make sure that everything looks good. So we try to make that next underwriting view as comprehensive as we can, have as much of the stuff on there as we need. So that's going to be kind of that timeline, right? And so once the appraisal comes back, once we've had your loan reviewed, typically at that point we have a very small list of conditions that are left over. Most of the time it's going to be clerical things such as getting just names updated, any sort of addresses that aren't making sense, just little tic tac here and there sort of items, right? And then once we have all of that, we're going to submit your loan back for what's called clear to close, right? So the underwriter is going to do their final review. They're going to say, okay, all of the conditions for this approval have been met. We are going to issue a clear to close on this file. And that's going to take us into the next step of everything, which is actually closing on your loan.
Yeah, that clear to close, going back to my statement about making that phone call to the buyer once their offer is accepted, the phone call to the buyer once they get the clear to close and to the seller is a great phone call to make too. Ultimately, at that point, there is nothing really standing in the way of getting to the closing table. I shouldn't say nothing. You do have a final walkthrough that could present some issues that I'll talk about here in a few minutes, but you really have not much standing in the way of you in the closing table at that point. So that conversation is a good one to have, especially with the other side, the seller, and giving them a call. Sometimes sellers and listing agents, especially when buyers are financing, are a little bit apprehensive about the process, maybe, questioning what if it's going to get done, stuff going on, whether et cetera, et cetera. So, when you make that phone call to the listing agent, let them know that we have a clear to close. You can definitely hear the excitement in their voice too, because they are ready to pass that information on to the seller and get to the closing table, get everybody happy. So,
Yeah. I echo all of that. I mean, I think he hit the nail on the head with some listing agents and sellers being apprehensive. We had a deal where, yeah, the listing agent was just, I think she had a couple of deals fall through recently. So she was very much so on edge, very much so just like, what is going on? Is this deal going to fall apart? Everything in between. It's like, let's all relax. Like let's take a step back. Let's take a beat. Everything's going to be all right. So that's obviously kind of our job on our end as well, is to kind of as the lender, because ultimately we're hands on in the process. Because once you get past home inspections, that sort of thing, I mean, really the last thing that's kind of standing in the way is financing, right? And making sure, obviously, appraisal, but appraisal and financing are going to be your two last things. And obviously we have a direct hand in both. I know we don't necessarily, we hire an appraiser to go out, so we don't really have a say in that side of things. But on the on the lending side, underwriting, all of that stuff is with us. So it's kind of on us to put everybody at ease and say, hey, look guys, let's take a step back here. Everything's all right. We're in a good position. There's nothing abnormal going on. So, and then also, running to problems as well. If there is problems, being upfront and honest with everybody about those, it goes a long way, because obviously holding on to things until 5 days before closing and, delivering the news then when everybody thinks everything's going great, that's never a fun conversation to have either. So, we try to pride ourselves on this side of everything, being very good at communication and letting everybody know what's going on, even if there is problems, because while it may not be a fun conversation, it's better to have it 2 weeks ahead of closing than 3 days when everybody thinks that we're closing. So
couldn't agree more, brother. Couldn't agree more. So, finishing up, getting us into the last little segment here of the episode. Once we have that clear to close in our hands, we are at that point going to work with the buyer, the seller, and the title company to get closing scheduled. Typically, we will go off of obviously what we wrote in the contract, closing date wise. In some instances, depending on when you get your clear to close and whatnot, and depending on buyer and seller schedules, that closing could, in theory, can be moved up. Just have to have both parties agree to that. But once we get that closing scheduled, we'll have a period 2 days prior to closing where we do that final walkthrough, as I mentioned. So you as the buyer and me as the agent are going to walk through the property and just make sure everything is still in working order as it was during our showing and during our inspections as well. The second purpose of the walkthrough is to ensure that any agreed upon repairs from the inspection report were done and completed at this point. And I would say that this is a time, as I just mentioned, that can present some problems if the repairs that were agreed upon were not completed at this point 2 days before closing. There will need to be a conversation to be had at that point with the listing agent, with the seller, see what the plans are, see what's going on, et cetera, et cetera. How can we get these number one done, or B, agreed upon to a solution where both the buyer and seller feel comfortable as well. So I have never had a buyer walk away from their final walkthrough, but it is possible. It can definitely happen. I think that you, Sam, right, have had a buyer walk through or walk away
Yeah,
on a
we
final
did.
walkthrough.
That
Yeah.
was
So
part of our whatever craziest business stories
yes.
or
Yep.
whatnot. Yeah, we
Yep.
did. It's very rare, but in this instance, yeah, the seller didn't do a lick of anything that they said they would. And so when she went and walked through, obviously, if you have a seller who agrees to do things and is not going to do things and then doesn't, you're probably not reaching a resolution at that point, because
Yep.
to operate in that amount of bad faith is probably not going to be indicative of them being willing to work once you do find out that they didn't do anything that they said they were going to do. So yeah, I think at that point she obviously realized like this is not going to happen, because they said they would do it, they're not going to do it, and I'm going to walk away. Because how would you feel ultimately in that situation, right? If you were bamboozled,
And
basically. I mean,
yeah, I would say bad faith is the right word to use there, right? In business transactions, you need to operate in good faith. And
yeah.
generally speaking, that's how most, buyers and sellers are operating, but we do have those bad apples here and there sometimes. So
Yeah, I can't get away from the bad apples in life, unfortunately. That's just part of it. But yeah, I mean, obviously, it's one of those things. You obviously, she invested a lot of, she invested 30 days working with us. She invested in an appraisal. She invested in all these things. I'm sure she was not happy, because I'm sure if she knew that he wasn't going to do these things from the get-go, she probably would have said, I'm going to walk away right now then. And so, I think bad faith is probably the perfect word there, because, I either he put her into a corner thinking that, well, if you go through all this, there's a good chance you're just going to buy it anyway. So why would I do? I don't know what ultimately happened on that end, but it's just a very, very strange situation. So if any of you are selling a home out there, don't be that person. Don't be that guy.
yeah, just
Nobody
say no up
that,
front. Like,
yeah,
I
like,
won't do the repairs. Like, that's simple as that.
yeah, honestly, because yeah, it just doesn't make very much sense. But yeah, I mean, getting back to kind of the closing side of the process, you obviously talked about final walkthrough. I know you mentioned not much standing in your way from getting the clear to close, or from actually closing. So I will say, on our side of things, obviously we do communicate with all parties, let them know, hey, we're clear to close. Let us know, when you want to close. Obviously, the closer that we get the clear to close to the closing date, the more straightforward it becomes, because obviously if we get the clear to close 2 days before we're supposed to close, that's likely going to remain the closing date, right? Obviously if we get one early, then we're going to negotiate that side of things and see what everybody wants to do. But I did want to mention, on our side, we do have what's called PTFs. They're called prior to funding conditions. And ultimately what this typically is going to boil down to is, most of the time it's just going to be a straightforward verification of employment to verify that you are still currently employed with your employer that we obviously used you to qualify income for. And the reason for saying that is because I want everybody to know that just because your loan is clear to close does not mean that the process is over on our end or over in general. Until you are sitting at the closing table signing your final documentation and bringing your funds for closing and all of that, the loan is not over. We have had clients who have legitimately left their jobs, and we have called to get um, you know, final verifications of employment. They'd be like, yeah, they don't work here anymore. They haven't worked here for a week or whatever the case may be. And it's like, guys, like, we cannot be doing that sort of thing, in what's going on, because obviously that's going to take us back out of clear close. And that's going to put us back into the process of now having to go back, verify your new employment, verify new income. And so there are still some things that are on the table when you do get your clear to close. So just something to think about. Obviously, final walkthrough, you're going to have prior to funding conditions that need to be done. Most of the time, again, very straightforward, just verifications of employment, that sort of thing. And the reason that we wait is because they actually have to be done within a certain amount of days of closing in order to be used. So if we had one 2 weeks ago, that it doesn't count. It's past the time period, right? So yeah. And then for closing itself, I mean that's all typically pretty straightforward, at our company, and I feel like a lot of I guess companies nowadays are doing hybrid closing. So you're going to sign half of your documents electronically. So you're going to get a big portion of the package on our app or in your email as you've been signing everything prior to this point. And then you're going to have a small package that's left over at the closing table to sign things like your deed, your note, your mortgage, things that need actual wet signatures on them. But it does drastically cut down on time. I mean, I've gone to a couple closings in the last year or so, and I mean, I used to go to closings a long time ago and they would be 45 minutes to an hour. And now they're, typically you can get them done in about 20 minutes, just depending obviously on your closer. Some like to be a lot chattier than others. Others just kind of get in and, put the docs in front of you and say, here you go, sign and go from there. So it all just depends on, a couple of different things. But, on our side of things, that's going to be kind of the final process is we're going to go through final numbers with you. We'll get everything balanced, get you out what your final closing is going to be. We'll get everything sent over to the title company and you'll electronically sign half your documents and the rest you'll take care of in person.
And once you get all those things signed and all taken care of at that point at closing, most typically, you're going to receive your keys right then and there, be able to head over to your new property and you're now a homeowner. So that, I guess I should backtrack a little bit. We do, there is a separate, in the contract, there is a separate section for possession. Generally speaking, we do write possession as of closing. Once closing is done, you now have possession of your new property. There are certain instances where you do give possession post-closing, and so you can't necessarily go over to the property right after closing and call it yours. But most typically we do write the possession as of closing. So at that point, you'll be able to head over to your new property, open the door, and get to work or start moving in, whatever you want to do. So ultimately, there are a couple of things post-closing that you'll want to be mindful of. You want to be able to get utilities turned on, make sure electric service, gas service, water service is started at your new property, any address changes for any mail, subscriptions, etc. And then, insurance confirmations, making sure that the insurance is set up on the correct property as well. So just some things to think about on the post-closing process. Once you sign all the documents, get your keys and head over to that new property.
Yeah, for sure. Well, guys, I mean, that's pretty much it, A to Z. Obviously, let's be honest. I mean, it's kind of hard to put 30 days into 30 minutes, right? So, I mean, there is obviously going to be some more stuff in the weeds. I know we've talked about it in previous episodes, or I've talked about it. There is a lot of paperwork that's required during your loan approval process. That's especially just depending on, your different loan types. Conventional is probably going to be your least amount of paperwork needed. But any government-backed program, FHA, USDA, VA, there's going to be more documentation typically than conventional. So, be patient with your lender, be patient with the people that you're working with. I know obviously there's a lot of excitement there. There's wanting to get to the closing table, that sort of thing. But, unfortunately, we don't make the rules. We don't make the guidelines. We just have to, we ultimately have to abide by them. So, we try to do our best to make the process as smooth and easy for you guys as possible. Communication is key, letting you guys know what's going on throughout the process and being upfront, straightforward. I try to collect as much docs as I can, as soon as we get started. So, just a couple of things to mention there, but yeah, that's kind of A to Z of what to expect, once your offer is accepted. So, obviously an exciting time to get your offer accepted, but the end of the road is not there yet.
Definitely. And again, it is a lot. We talked about the process, and it may, again, seem short because we crammed it into 30 minutes, but there is a lot going on. There's a lot of moving pieces. And I think that you mentioned it earlier, just communication as a whole is super key during this process between the buyer, between the lender, between the real estate agent, between the seller, between the listing agent, all of the above. Communication is key. So just got to make sure you're with the right team and communicating and getting all of the things that you need to get done in a timely manner, and everything, in my opinion, will always go smoothly at that point. So,
yeah, for sure, man.
Well, thank you guys. Hopefully you guys found some value in today's episode. Enjoyed putting together a little roadmap from acceptance to closing, and excited to get our episode out next week. Thank you guys, and we will see you guys again next week.